Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Ochako falls in love with villain Izuku, movie. So before we start, go check out the author of this fanfic, Killing Harvest, link is in the description, also subscribe to our channel, and like this video. So let's begin the video. All Might had just left the rooftop, leaving Izuku alone with his thoughts. Suddenly, without warning, he fell down and crouched next to the ledge of the building. Why? Izuku sobbed to himself on the rooftop, tears creeping out of his eyes, crying. Why is it that I can't be a hero? Izuku continues, crouched up against the edge of the building, holding his legs. Am I just that much of a dead weight to society that not even All Might believes I can be a hero? Izuku screams to himself in his head, getting up, wiping the tears off his face. Why is it that Kaken gets to be a hero when all he does is torture me? Izuku says to himself, clenching his fists. I'll show them. I'll show them all. Izuku screams to the sky, just barely loud enough for the people below to hear, but pay no mind. Then Izuku starts chuckling to himself as his hair falls over his face, covering his eyes as he hunches over. Just wait, Kaken, All Might. I'll be coming back, and when I do, Izuku says as his chuckling increases in volume and pace. I'll show you what it feels like to be weak. Izuku screams to the sky again, throwing his arms out, laughing hysterically. Suddenly, slow clapping is heard from the other side of the building as a figure walks toward Izuku wearing a bright orange overcoat, feathered top hat, and a mask hiding his face. Bravo my friend, bravo, encore. The man says, clapping his gloved hand, rapidly imitating an audience at a performance. Izuku just stares at him blankly as the man keeps clapping. Splendid performance my friend, and such a wonderful climax. The person says, slightly laughing at themselves, but stops. Thanks is all Izuku says as he just stares at someone aside from his mother actually commenting on him. Fake coughing noises, the man fake coughs into his fist as he clears his throat. I must say that was quite the performance. Such action, such drama, such heartbreak. The person says in a playful tone, spinning in place theatrically. That to the point. Izuku says bluntly as the man stops spinning and extends his hand for a handshake. Well my young friend, I must say I'm touched by your story and have an offer for you. They say as Izuku just stares at them. Tough crowd, tough crowd. The person says to themselves, withdrawing their hand. That to the point please. Izuku says, annoyed, sighing. Well, like I said before, I was touched by your story and would like to offer you a position. The person says, pulling a card out of their overcoat pocket and tossing it to Izuku, who catches it. Seiko Atsuhiro, traveling magician and stage performer. Izuku mumbles to himself, reading the card. Exactly my dear friend, Seiko Atsuhiro, at your service. Seiko says, pulling out a deck of playing cards from his coat pocket and air shuffling them. Pick a card, any card. Seiko says, gleefully holding the entire deck separated upside down. Okay. Izuku says, confused, but nonetheless reaches out and picks a card. Very good, now then. Seiko says, shuffling the deck again. I'm going to pull the opposite suit color of the same card you have in your hand. Seiko says, pulling up a card while Izuku looks at his card, the 6 of clubs. And look at that, I pulled the 6 of spades. Seiko says, chuckling as Izuku just looks confused. Look, you mentioned an offer, what was it? Izuku says in a demanding voice, tossing the card back to Seiko. Well lad, I believe you, and I could be partners. Seiko says, leaning down on Izuku, putting one arm around his shoulders and motioning with the other one. Imagine it, you and me on the stage with the thunderous applause of the crowd. People laugh all the while, having no idea what happens behind the scenes. Seiko says, putting his arm around Izuku and waving the other one in front of them. What exactly goes on behind the scenes? Izuku asks in a less demanding, more curious tone. Well my dear friend, learn that you'll need to accept my offer. Seiko says, releasing Izuku and stepping aside. Join me as my assistant. Choose your own path, be what you want to be and not what others tell you. You realize if I join you I will be considered by all means a villain, then right? Izuku says, side-eyeing the man before him. That's your choice to make in whether or not you accept. Seiko says, straightening his sleeve cuff. Izuku thought for a moment what it would be like being the complete opposite of what he wanted to be his whole life. Then he thought about what that would entail for himself. Leaving his old life behind her, a new one where he most likely wouldn't be judged for being quirkless, but for his skills in villainy or on the stage. As Izuku was going to say he accepted, he stopped mid-sentence, causing Atsuhiro to look at him through his mask. Izuku had realized what this would mean for his mother. He would most likely never see her again. After all, if he did become a villain, then the competition would try to get to him through her. And if he was ever found out, then the heroes would assume she was an accomplice and arrest her. Well, what's your answer? I accept. Izuku said more confidently, this time standing straight up. But on a few conditions. Izuku continued before Seiko could say anything. And they would be? Seiko asked, leaning forward on his cane. When I live with you so my mother doesn't get involved with anything. Izuku said, holding back tears at the thought of leaving his mother. Alright. And the others? Seiko motions for Izuku to continue. I am provided a new wardrobe and an altered appearance to hide my real identity from people who might recognize me or the heroes and police who might search for me. Izuku continued. And? 3. I am to be allowed my own free will. Well, I will listen to you. I would like to have my own life while doing it. Izuku said, looking at the person who he now works for. Nothing wrong with any of those terms. Seiko says, standing up off his cane as it suddenly turns into a marble and he puts it in his coat pocket. Now then, for the reasons you just listed and your own personal safety, Seiko says, as off in the distance an explosion is heard. I'm going to temporarily turn you into a marble until we get back to my dwelling area. Seiko finishes as Izuku nods and steps forward. Just think of this as an opportunity for a long nap. Seiko says as he touches Izuku's head and turns him into a marble and puts it into his pocket. Must say a rather interesting lad. Smart enough to choose his own path. And soon with enough brawn and skill to back it up, Seiko says, jumping from rooftop to rooftop quickly and silently. The next day. Nobody was really all that concerned when Izuku hadn't shown up to school the next day. Other than Inko Midoriya. DCH. Useless nerd. Too much of a quirkless damn coward to face me. Kitsuki grumbled to himself throughout the day. Please be safe my baby please. Inko cried to herself all day watching the news in hopes of something about Izuku turning up. Little did anybody know that the boy mocked for being quirkless and called a useless Deku would now be the thing many feared and laughed at. Welcome back to the land of the living my friend. Seiko says as Izuku groggily rubs his eyes and takes in his surroundings, seeing he is in pretty much an average looking living room. Where are we? Izuku asks, standing up. At my current abode. Please forgive me. I've yet to tidy it up. Seiko says, walking over to the room. Follow me. Seiko says as Izuku walks into what looks like a costume room with a little salon chair and sinks in one corner. Now since you don't want to be recognized, the best thing to do is to completely change your appearance. Seiko says, grabbing a bottle of purple and red hair dye among a shelf full of colors. Why purple and red? Izuku asks curiously. Because they go well together and since you and I will be on stage together. Seiko motions for Izuku to sit down. Now this will be a while so don't move. Okay. Also you'll need to decide on a new name for yourself since using your current one would be risky. Seiko says as Izuku thinks. Take your time while I go ahead with the makeover. Seiko says and Izuku can swear he is grinning behind the grinning mask. Now then try not to squirm. Seiko says, removing his coat, gloves and hat. By the way, since every villain seems to have a name, what's your villain name? Izuku asks curiously. It's both classy and original. Neat. Izuku says as Compress begins applying the bleach to his hair as it slowly turns from green to blonde. Now while I let the bleach do its work I'll begin on your face. Compress says, grabbing a thing of makeup and gently powdering it on Izuku's face. Since that freckled mess of a face would easily be recognized, we need to mask it. Whatever. 2 hours later. And done. Seiko says, stepping back as Izuku sits up. So how do I look? Izuku asks. See for yourself. Seiko says, grabbing a mirror and holding it in front of Izuku's face. To say Izuku was impressed was an understatement. Even he could hardly tell he was the same person. His once normal toned freckled face was now replaced by a much smoother shade of white, but not enough to make it look unrealistic. His once green hair was now purple with a red tip at the end. Finally his once bright green eyes were now staring into a pair of red eyes to match the tips of his hair. Well, what do you think? Compress asks, a little nervous having never done this before. Perfect. It's perfect, I barely even recognize myself. Izuku says, standing up from the chair he was in and grabbing a comb and brush. I take it you want a new hairstyle, Seiko says, walking over to the clothing racks as Izuku fiddles with his hair. By the way, Seiko says, walking up to Izuku with a pile of clothes in his hands, did you decide on a name for yourself? At this Izuku stopped. True, he had picked out a name, but it was what his new boss would say about it that he was nervous about. I have a name. But promise you won't laugh. Izuku asks as Compress nods. I hardly knew my father. In all, and completely honestly apart from my mother, you're one of the few to show me kindness. Izuku says, looking down. It was my choice, you know, but go on. Compress urges. Since I am, and will never again be Izuku Midoriya. Izuku pauses for a breath. I have decided to rename myself Kuro Atsuhiro. Izuku says, praying he didn't make a mistake. Neither one says anything for a moment until Kuro feels a hand on his shoulder. Well then, welcome to the family of Kuro Atsuhiro. Seiko says as his body subconsciously moves and gives his new son a hug. It was at this point both of them knew they were in for a more adventure-filled life. And they both were ready for it. It's been a few days since Izuku Midoriya, the kind, timid but all-around nice person, became Kuro Atsuhiro, a villain. In just a few days Kuro has been with his new adopted father. He has already developed some proficiency in pickpocketing. However, believes it would be better for both of them to lay low and hone Kuro's skills to both stay out of the spotlight but wait for the fuss of the search for Izuku Midoriya to subside. Currently they were practicing on Kuro's speed and reflexes. Since Izuku had been slow and weak, not wanting to fight back, Kuro would be the exact opposite. Silent, swift and deadly. "Come on Kuro, it shouldn't hurt that bad," said, standing back watching his adopted son trying to do an elevated split while holding two 20-pound weights in his hands. "I never said it did," Kuro said as he was slowly inching his legs apart, struggling to both do a split and hold the weights. "Alright, you can stop if you want to. I can see you're straining yourself," Sao says as he watches Kuro still trying the exercise. "Stubborn, as usual," Seiko says to himself, walking away. Truth be told, he couldn't be any more proud of his son. For the past few days not only has he gotten faster and more agile, but also developed many skills in the sleight of hand. That being said, he was also a little arrogant, refusing to stop even if he was in pain. Still, that could just be chalked up to determination and sheer will to get better. "Done," Kuro said, dropping both weights and standing up slowly since his leg muscles were sore from stretching. "But now then, change into your jogging clothes and we'll do our 20-mile run," Seiko said, once again grinning behind his already grinning mask as Kuro just nodded and ran to his room. While Kuro's room was bigger than his old room, as Izuku, it was still pretty bare. Pretty much all he had was a twin-sized bed, a closet, desk, and a dresser. Since he couldn't risk going back to Izuku's old room to get anything, he was going to need to buy some more decorative stuff when he was actually allowed to help Seiko with his crimes and make money. As he changed into his jogging clothes, he also went into his bathroom and reapplied his coat of makeup. According to Seiko, this was supposed to be sweaty and water resistant so he could keep up the guise of Kuro Atsuhiro without having to worry about the makeup washing off. When he finished applying the makeup, he went back downstairs to find his adoptive father still in his jogging clothes, which was still his everyday clothes of a giant bright orange and yellow trench coat, mask, and his top hat. "Ready?" Seiko asks, walking to the exit door to their safe house. "Ready," Kuro says as he follows Seiko out the door and they begin their jog. To say Seiko was fast would be an understatement. He could literally move so fast you couldn't hear him, and he was so agile you couldn't even catch or hit him. However, since Kuro had only done this jog 2 times before, Seiko had learned to keep up with Kuro's pace and help him get faster. Being that the heroes and police were also at the same time looking for Izuku Midoriya, Seiko had been very selective about when he and Kuro would go outside. Being that he wanted it to be discovered that Kuro Atsuhiro was Izuku Midoriya and were both villains, it was crucial to know when to step out into the limelight and when to stay behind the closed curtains. "Come on Kuro, we can go faster than this. Come on, only 12 more miles to go before we finish and head back for dinner," Seiko says as Kuro grits his teeth and runs faster. Currently Seiko and Kuro were running through the bad part of the town, where people who are too poor to afford anything better or villains looking to escape or hide from heroes come. Seiko, however, would take no chances with Kuro. So in their spare time he had educated Kuro on many of the common villains that frequent the area, so Kuro would know exactly who he would be up against. 1 hour later. "Good job Kuro, you not only did the 20 miles, but shaved off 14 minutes from last time," Seiko says, patting Kuro on the back, who was panting and gasping for breath. "Here, drink this." Compress as pulling out a marble from his coat pocket as it turns into a bottled water and hands it to Kuro. "Thanks," Kuro says, drinking the water and wiping sweat from his forehead. "But now, I don't want to do this often, but I have business with a friend in the area and would like to request that you stay here," Seiko says as Kuro nods. "Good. Now then, please stay in the area so I can find you. I will be 15 minutes tops," Seiko says, heading off down the pretty much empty street. Seeing as how he had nothing better to do and time to kill, Kuro retreated into a nearby back alley to work out more. You could basically consider working out to be Kuro's form of a drug addiction, as he was constantly either stretching, jogging, lifting weights, or punching and kicking something to get stronger and faster. After about 6 minutes of punching the alley wall to build up his fist's pain endurance, Kuro hears a scream from inside the alleyway network. Normally that wouldn't be uncommon in this area considering all the thieves, rapists and murderers who hide here, but the very small fragment of Izuku Midoriya that remained inside Kuro Atsuhiro, that still wanted to be a hero, found himself rushing through the alleyways to find the source of the scream. After about 1 minute of running through the alleys which he had mapped like a maze, he arrived at where the screams were coming from. It was a girl most likely no older than himself who was in the clutches of one of the many villains that came to the area. That villain would be Agurosi Takanaka, one of the more well-known rapists who even in the villain community was disliked, as he primarily targeted children as his victims. As Kuro regained himself and was about to leave, Agurosi shifted his body while toying with a girl before he raped her. Kuro saw the face of the girl and instantly wished he hadn't. Even through his makeup he could feel his face go a bright red and his heart began beating faster. The girl in question had brown hair and eyes with a permanent blush on her cheeks. Why did I have to look at her? Kuro asks himself facepalming. Okay, let's see here. Seiko said that Agurosi likes to play with his victims before raping them and that his Quirkaqua body only let him breath through the gills on his neck. As Kuro was deciding what to do to help the girl, a figurative light bulb appeared over his head. Reaching into his pocket he grabbed a tiny pellet. According to Seiko, these were used in his shows for a dramatic reveal or a mysterious disappearance. But that wasn't what interested Kuro at the moment. The pellets, while they didn't last very long, would still provide a smokescreen to help get the girl away safely. As Kuro prepared himself to sprint like hell was breaking loose, he picked up a medium-sized chunk of debris that he could throw to divert Agurosi's attention. 3, 2, 1. Kuro said in his head as he rushed from his opening and threw the piece of debris at Agurosi, who screamed in pain, and the girl was gasping in shock. "Ow, you fucking bitch." Agurosi screamed as he began running toward Kuro with a knife drawn. Kuro however took this opportunity to throw the pellet in the middle of Agurus and the girl, as the area instantly filled with smoke and the girl along with Agurus were caught off guard. What happened? The girl was cut mid-sentence by Kuro placing his hand over her mouth and whispering in her ear to follow him and run. The girl nods in agreement as Kuro takes her hand, albeit while blushing like crazy, and leads her down the way he came, but throwing a few more twists and turns to be safe as shouts of Agurosi echoed through the background, mainly consisting of the F and B words. As both teens exit the alley system where Kuro and Seiko had stopped jogging, Kuro releases the girl. "Thank you," she says while looking down and blushing herself. "What are you doing here?" Kuro asks, getting straight to the point, further inspecting the girl. While she didn't appear to have a whole lot of money, she didn't appear to be in dire need of money as those that live in the area, nor did she appear to be a villain. "Well, I was walking back to my house when that guy grabbed me from behind and pulled me into a van. They knocked me out and the next thing I know I'm in that alleyway with him taunting me," she says, holding back tears of disappointment and embarrassment in herself. "Do you know where you are?" Kuro asks again as the girl shakes her head no. "You're on the west side of town," Kuro says as the girl gasps in shock. "The West Wing? As in the one where all the runaway villains come to?" the girl asks in shock. "Is there any other way?" Kuro asks bluntly, trying to maintain his calmness and not break down into the stuttering mess that Izuku was with girls. "Then why are you here?" the girl asks with a tinge of fear in her voice, hoping the person who just saved her doesn't say what she thinks he will. "I'm going to let you answer that for yourself," Kuro says, giving off what he dubbed the trademark Seiko mask smirk that Seiko always does behind his mask. Are you a villain?" the girl asks, stuttering between words trying to regain her composure. "Maybe I'm not," Kuro says, leaning towards the girl, "and maybe I am." "Stay back," the girl says, walking backwards, tensing up. "If I wanted to hurt you, then why would I save you from the fish freak?" Kuro says, pointing at the alleyway exit entrance that they came out of. "What do you want?" she asks, trying to not show him that she's afraid. "Nothing really. Truth be told, nobody really likes Agurosi, so anything we can do to tick him off we do," Kuro says, giving a smirk, not actually wanting to say he has a crush on her, as he reaches into his pockets again. As he does this, the girl flinches back. She hardly knows anything about him apart from he's a villain, and yet he saved her from the guy who was going to rape her. As he pulls something out of his pocket, she closes her eyes in fear until she feels something being put into her hand. As she opens her eyes to look at it, she sees that it looks like a map. "Take it, it's a map of how to get out of here. Don't bother trying to return it," Kuro says as he leans up against the bare brick wall of the building they are next to. The girl doesn't say anything for a bit until she speaks up. "Why?" she asks him as he looks at her in confusion. "Why what?" Kuro asks as he looks straight at her. "You're a villain, so why help me?" she asks him, generally curious as to why a villain would help her be a hopeful future hero in training. "Because I felt like it. Do I need a reason to help anyone?" Kuro says plainly. "No. I guess not." she says quietly. If it's all the same to you then, you might want to head out. The later in the night the more villains you'll fight, as they say around here. Kuro tells her, pointing up at the sun which is close to setting. Okay then. She says, as she looks at the maps and begins to head off, but stops. If it's alright with you, can I ask your name since you saved me? She asks him, hoping he gives it to her. Only if you give yours first. Kuro says, but then instantly starts blushing as she does the same. It's Uraraka Ochako. Uraraka says, blushing brightly. Neither of them say anything after that until Uraraka speaks up. Aren't you going to give your name? She asks, blushing. Tell me, why would a villain give their name away? Kuro says, giving off another trademark Seiko mask smirk. But you said. I lied. The whole purpose of being a villain and a hero is to not let your real identity be known. Kuro says, dully looking straight at her. Oh, I see. Uraraka says, fighting back tears. Like I said, you might want to hurry up, it's at least an hour-long run from here to the exit, not counting other people. Kuro says, motioning for her to run off. Fine then. She says, as she turns around and begins running off towards the exit while tapping her clothes. As she disappears from sight, Kuro waits a few moments before talking. Sigh, why am I such an idiot? Kuro says, slamming his fist against the wall. In truth, Kuro had wanted to tell her his name, but couldn't. Well, he wasn't a well-known villain, he was a villain nonetheless. Even still, the girl had given him her name, so at least he knew who she was. So how did the first date go? Seiko asks, suddenly appearing leaning against the wall beside Kuro, who stumbles backward in shock. What? When? How? It wasn't a date. Kuro stutters, trying to hide his blush. Yeah, you're right. That was more like a bad confession. Seiko says, get up from the wall. How much did you see? Kuro asks, a bit nervous. Enough. That's not an answer. Kuro says, flustered. In any case, come on. Seiko says, waving for Kuro to follow him as they both head back to their house for the night. 2 months later. It's been 2 months since that guy helped Uraraka. Truth be told, even if he was a villain, she had to be grateful to him. Of course, the police questioned her when she made it back home and asked for descriptions, both physical and quirk related to both individuals she encountered. They also asked for the map that she was given to see if there were any fingerprints that matched the files they had in the International Villain Database. But ever since then, he was one of the main things in her mind. Why did he save me? Uraraka asked herself while laying in her bed at night. I mean, even if he was a villain, he saved me. Uraraka told herself. Even though he didn't have to help me, he did. Why did he do it? He was a villain. So why? These questions swam around in her head for a long while that night. Eventually, she just looked over at her alarm clock, which read 11:23. Fortunately for her, it wasn't a school night. Maybe she could go for a walk to clear her head. No, her parents were still worried that she would get taken again, and she didn't want to put more stress on them. Earlier in the day, she overheard her parents talking that a big client of her dad's had decided to take his business elsewhere, resorting to him having to let a few people go to continue paying his workers. Sigh, oh well, maybe a glass of water would help. Uraraka said to herself as she got up from her bed and left the room. Unknown to her, someone was watching through the window as the lights to her bedroom turned on and she left the room. Quickly jumping down from the ledge he was standing on, the person cloaked in darkness quickly but silently crept towards the window. Entering, the light emitting from inside revealed the person to be Kuro Atsuhiro, dressed in a black hoodie and jeans. As he reached into the pouch of his hoodie, he pulled out a small silver object and a bobby pin. Come work with me. Kuro quietly said to himself as he inserted both items into the outside lock of the window and started moving them around until a click was heard. Bingo, he said to himself. As Kuro entered the room, careful not to make any noise, he returned both items into the pouch and pulled out a piece of paper. As Kuro checked to make sure he grabbed the paper, he could hear Uraraka's footsteps coming from outside down the hall. Silently, he placed the piece of paper on Uraraka's nightstand next to her alarm clock and then moved towards the window. Just as he entered outside, he heard the creak of Uraraka opening her door and decided to book it without having time to close the window. He just barely was able to clear the area as Uraraka entered her room. Huh. I didn't leave the window open, did I? Uraraka asked herself, walking over towards her window, setting her drink down on her nightstand next to a note she didn't notice. As Uraraka looked outside her window, cautiously checking if anyone was there, and seeing no one, shrugged her shoulders, she closed it. Huh. Guess maybe I did leave it open, she said as she sat down on the edge of her bed and picked up her glass of water. Upon doing this, she noticed the note. What's this? She asked herself as she set her water down and unfolded the note. Hey Uraraka, so you might not remember me, but I was the guy that helped you a few months ago. Now before you freak out, yes, I did put this in your room, and yes, I know where you live. However, I would like to see you again if that's okay. And before you start screaming no, I will not kidnap you or make you do anything. If you're able, I thought we could have tea at a cafe I know of next Friday at 3, my treat. The address is on the back of the note. So anyways, hope to see you soon. Sincerely, Ka. Don't freak out. He tells me to not freak out when he's been stalking me the last 2 months. Uraraka screamed to herself in her head. As she reread the letter, her eyes fell upon his initials, recalling back to when she gave her his name, and he refused to give his. Maybe this was a sign of trust, she didn't know. Where is this place anyway? Uraraka asked herself as she flipped the note over. -1046, Suzuki Suntan Street. PS meet me at the intersection down the road from the cafe first. Seems like he might want to just hang out. Uraraka thought to herself, blushing slightly as a daydream of her and him having tea in a restraint entered her mind. No, snap out of it, girl, remember he's a villain. Uraraka said, snapping herself out of the daydream. Calming down and taking a few breaths, she reread the note again. Next Friday. That leaves 8 days until he wants to meet. Uraraka thought to herself. For a while she just sat in silence, contemplating over whether or not she should go. What would happen if she didn't show up? Whoever he was knew where she lived and had already broken in. Plus she was a hopeful future hero in training. So if she was affiliated with a villain, that would not bode well for her reputation. Then again, at the same time, she was a teenager with hormones going through her, so what does she know? After what seemed like hours of contemplating, Uraraka took a glance at her alarm clock to see that it was 12:21. I'll think more about it in the morning, she said to herself as she got up and made sure all the windows in her room were locked. After she made sure that the windows were locked, she turned her light out and fell down on her bed with heavy eyelids, slowly closing her into a dreamlike state of mind. Unfortunately for her, that dream included her and him having a date. Even when she's asleep, he's on her mind. At the Atsuhiro safe house. As Kuro silently creeped through the entrance to the safe house, careful to not make any noise, he slowly opened the door to take a peek inside. He checked everywhere 3 times for his adopted father, as literally he had the habit of showing up out of nowhere when you least expected. Phew. Coast clear. Kuro thought as he walked inside, shut the door, and turned on the light. And where, may I ask, have you been? Seiko said, leaning against the closed door behind Kuro, who recoiled in both shock and fear. When will you stop doing that? Kuro said, recovering from a near heart attack on the 21st. And yes, he's kept count. I'll stop doing this when you stop giving me the opportunity to. Seiko said, walking forward. I'm just gonna go on a hunch here and say you went to that girl's house. Seiko said, taking off one of his many masks and narrowing his eyes. How did you have the smell of perfume and female aromas around you? Seiko interrupts Kuro, who immediately starts fidgeting. So what if I went to her house? You never said I couldn't. Kuro says defensively. I also said to keep a low profile since that incident with Takanaka in the alleys. And I don't believe going on a date with a girl you rescued who knows you're a villain is keeping it low pro. Seiko states as Kuro just starts tapping his fingers together. 1 week starting tonight. No tricks, no crimes, no nothing, but you and your room. Seiko says, pointing to Kuro's room, as he only nods and replies with a meek yes sir. As he treks to his room. Oh, and Kuro, Seiko starts as Kuro turns around to look at him. If you behave well enough, I might let you off a day early and help you prepare for the date. Seiko says, giving one of his smirks as Kuro just nods and walks into his room. In the last 2 months he has been able to get enough money from pickpocketing random people to helping Seiko with small heists to start out. He managed to purchase himself a new phone since he can't use his old one. His new phone isn't bad, but it's not as great as an average smartphone. He also managed to buy a few outfits of civilian clothes that were non-hero based since he wasn't even remotely attracted to heroes anymore. And a poster from some American heavy metal band that played music. But his prize for the newest edition was his villain outfit he was making. Seiko had been nice enough after a month of training to contact one of his associates who made villain support gear on the black market to get Kuro his own villain gear. His villain outfit consisted of a custom-made purple button-up trench jacket with black trim, riddled with secret pockets and pouches everywhere, a pair of specially woven black pants that could withstand fire and had places to put weapons such as knives, a belt with a few compartments hanging off of it for storage, and a mask much like his father's. However, his mask was different. His mask had eyes much like Seiko's usual mask he wore, but the end of the eyes went straight down into a grinning mouth that matched his father's. Currently his outfit was hanging up in his closet along with some of his other clothes. Ugh. Stupid. 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 Kuro groaned to himself as he flopped down on his bed and pulled out his phone. This was the 4th time he had been grounded in the past 2 months. The first was a 3-day-long one after he had saved Uraraka. The second and third ones were from failed attempts to sneak out, which landed him 2 weeks each. Thinking about it now, he was surprised his adoptive father didn't ground him longer this time. Not feeling tired, he unlocked his phone and grabbed a pair of earbuds off of his nightstand and plugged them in. Opening up to the music app, he hit shuffle on his custom playlist as heavy metal soon began to pound in his ears. Ever since he became Kuro Atsuhiro, many of his tastes have changed. Before, he much preferred classical or pop music rather than heavy metal and rock. Even his taste in clothing changed as he wore much darker clothing. As Kuro just laid on his bed mindlessly listening to music, lost in thought, he found himself thinking about this coming Friday. Since he was grounded until the day of the date, maybe a day sooner if he was lucky. He was suddenly thinking about what to wear or if he should change up his hairstyle to hopefully impress Uraraka. Then he thought about the possibility that she wouldn't come and would instead ignore the letter. Nope. No. Just don't think like that and believe she will come, Kuro said to himself, snapping the bad thoughts out of his head, and instead found himself thinking about her in specific. He couldn't deny he had an attraction to her. Not saying he was a pervert, but she was just the right size in more than one area apart from height for her to be perfect in his eyes. Just thinking about her made a light blush dust across his cheeks. But if he had to say, the best part about her was her face. The way her hair extends to just her shoulders and the permanent blush on her cheeks made him blush harder thinking about it. As the metal music continued to play in his ears, he found himself drifting off to sleep with the only thing on his mind being how his first date would go. However, unknown to Kuro, after he fell asleep, Seiko had quietly entered his room to take a leave of a few things. Since I know how important this date is for you, Kuro, I thought I might leave you a little present for luck, Seiko said, putting a gift box wrapped up on Kuro's nightstand. Also, just a word to the wise. Don't use too much of it. Otherwise it has the opposite effect. Seiko finishes walking out the door, leaving the slumbering teen to his own dream fantasy. 1 week later. It's been 2 months since that useless nerd Deku disappeared without a trace. In all honesty, Katsuki Bakugo could care less whether or not the nerd was still alive. Maybe he actually did something right for once and took my advice. Katsuki grumbled to himself, listening to his teacher do a boring ass lecture on science or something. The only thing that really changed with Katsuki since Izuku disappeared was how often he would visit Inko. Just thinking about her sad face after Deku disappeared pissed him off. Who did Deku think he was, making his mother break down crying every night? After about an hour of the boring mindless lecturing, the bell rang, signaling classes were over. Normally Katsuki was the last one out since he really didn't like to deal with people after school. When everyone left the room, Katsuki suddenly found himself staring at an empty desk. But not just any empty desk. It was the desk that belonged to Izuku Midoriya. God, why am I thinking about that useless nerd now? Katsuki grumbled while walking out of school. As Katsuki was walking back to his house, he passed by an alley. For some reason though, he really hated this area for some weird reason. If he had to guess, it was probably because I reminded him of that bastard Deku. TCH. Whatever. Katsuki said, as he just angrily glared at the alleyway, walking by it in his usual smug manner. True, as Katsuki was heading back to his house, he had plans to take a detour over to the Midoriya household. This was for 2 reasons, one that he wanted to avoid his mother, since the old hag had been on his case since Izuku's disappearance. And the other was to say hi to Inko. Ever since Izuku disappeared, she had enjoyed Katsuki's company immensely. Wonder how she's doing right now. Midoriya household. Currently at the Midoriya household, Inko was sitting on the couch wrapped in a blanket. She was currently watching whatever shows came across the channel she scrolled through. Clutched in one hand was the remote that she was using. And in the other was a picture of Izuku when he was young, clutched against her chest. When she held the picture close to her, it almost felt like Izuku was still with her. As she scrolled through the channel, she stopped at a news alert about a new villain that had begun making a name for himself. And once again, the infamous villain that has been dubbed the Black Marble is still at large. The female newscaster said, as a security camera footage picture of a man in a purple trench jacket was displayed behind her, with his face hidden behind a mask. While this villain has only committed theft-related crimes, it is unknown whether or not they serve a higher purpose. If spotted, alert the authorities and any nearby heroes immediately. Now back to the weather. The newscaster finished, as another newscaster in front of a weather map appeared, spewing the inaccurate nonsense of the weather they predicted, as Inko switched the channels. Just then she heard a knock at the door. Come in. Inko said loud enough so the person could hear, as they opened up the door and walked in. Oh Katsuki, what brings you here? Inko said, as happily as she could while still holding back the depression that was building up. Hey, I was just stopping by to say hi. Katsuki said in a very soft, sincere, and respectful tone, unlike his usual one. The reason for this being that he considered Inko like a second mother, except unlike his own mother Inko truly acted like a mother. "Oh, please do stay for a cup of tea though," Inko said, unwrapping herself from the blanket and bringing the picture of Izuku with her to the kitchen. Kitsuki took a seat next to where Inko had been sitting and just sat still with his hands folded in his lap. "So Kitsuki, how was school today?" Inko asks from the kitchen as she begins boiling a kettle of water. It was pretty boring. The teacher just talked a lot about how maths is the savior of humanity and we will always use it," Kitsuki said in a joking manner as Inko just softly smiled and let out a small giggle. Upon both seeing and hearing, Kitsuki smiled. Inko was certainly doing better than she was 2 months ago. Back then Inko would hardly talk to anyone or leave the house. It eventually got so bad that Kitsuki's mother punched the door down and forced Inko to hang out with her and Kitsuki. That night ended with Inko crying into Mitsuki's arms as she cried about how much she missed Izuku. "Well, as long as you're doing well in your Kitsuki studies and behaving, I'm fine with it if you tone your teacher's lectures out," Inko said as she and Kitsuki laughed at her remark as she poured them both a cup of tea. Bringing the cups with her to the living room and sitting next to Kitsuki giving him one of the cups, Inko's face dropped a little as she sighed. This reminded her of what she used to do with Izuku sometimes. He and she would often just watch a movie together as they both just munched on snacks and drinks together on the couch. At this, Kitsuki reached out with his free hand and put it on Inko's shoulder, snapping her out of her haze. "Oh, sorry Kitsuki. It's just that things have been rough for me since Izuku went missing," Inko said, clutching the picture of Izuku harder against her chest as she fought back greatly against the tears welling up in her eyes. Kitsuki retracted his hand and just stared down blankly at his cup of tea. He knew better than to insult Izuku in front of Inko. As much as he hated the nerd, the last thing anyone wanted was to upset Inko more than she currently was. They both just sat quietly after that. The joyful mood that one temporarily filled the house was now replaced with a depressed atmosphere. Both of them quietly and slowly sipped their tea for hours. It wasn't until Inko started dropping tears that Kitsuki truly felt sorrow for someone genuinely. Instinctively, Kitsuki set his cup down and walked in front of Inko and placed his hand on her shoulders and looked her in the eyes. "I promise you. When I become number 1 I will find Izuku," Kitsuki started and dragged his sorry ass back here to you. Inko just wrapped Kitsuki in a giant bear hug as he accepted it since there were only 3 things he actually feared. 1. Having a sad Inko, which would most likely have been caused by denial of the hug. 2. His mother when she was angry. Trust him when he says that his mother's true anger can make both Benson and Nicole Watterson's anger breakout seem like mere temper tantrums to her. And 3 was what he was going to do would he ever find that damn quirkless bastard Deku again. "Thank you Kitsuki. Thank you for being here for me," Inko cried through her tears as she let Kitsuki go. "Now go home. We both know what your mother will do if you're late home again," Inko said as Kitsuki just nodded and walked to the door. "Oh, thanks for the tea Inko, it was good," Kitsuki said as he left the house and started his route home. It was days like these that made Kitsuki truly happy. And by all means he intended to keep his promise to Inko if it meant seeing her real smile again. Intersection near 1046 Suzuki Suntan Street. Ochako stood at the intersection waiting for the person she was supposed to meet. He said to arrive at the intersection first for some reason. "I hope he shows," Uraraka said to herself just standing in the area at the intersection as she just looked at all the people she saw walking by. But the weird thing she saw was that most of the more unique looking individuals were all going into the building down the street that the letter mentioned as a cafe. After about 5 more minutes Uraraka was about to leave until she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning around she went wide-eyed at who it was. He was in front of her wearing a black hoodie with a white undershirt and jeans. It was a much different contrast to her pink skirt and lighter shade of pink shirt with another different shade jacket. "So how long have you been waiting?" Kuro asks her as the usual small bluish tinged her cheeks. "Not long. Now before we get started explain this," Uraraka says, shoving his letter he gave her in his face as he just takes it and throws it into a nearby trash can. "Wanted to say hi without you freaking out in public," Kuro says as suddenly Uraraka raises her voice. "Then why would you break into my house and into my room?" she asked a little loudly. "Cool it with the voice, you'll cause a scene," Kuro said, trying to calm her down as a slight panicked look filled his eyes as he saw people watching. "Fine, I'll calm down when you give me what you promised me," Uraraka said, pulling him closer. "Name it. Your name. Now," Uraraka demanded as Kuro started sweating. "Promise it'll be a Yumi-kinda deal," Kuro said, trying to make it easier on himself. "Promise," Uraraka said. "Let him go." "Fine then," Kuro said, sighing. "It's Kuro Atsuhiro." At this Uraraka went full on, the schoolgirl just talked to her crush's blush rating on the scale as she just looked at him. So wanna get on with the date? Kuro said, as snapped out of her blush slightly and shook her head. Then follow me. Kuro said, as he led her to the building all the unique people were entering. So what kind of cafe is this? Uraraka asked as he went up to the front door and made the shush motion. Just some warning, the people you meet here might be a bit extravagant. Kuro said as he opened the door and they walked inside. Uraraka went wide-eyed at the interior of the building. It resembled a mix of an old western saloon mixed with a bar and a restaurant. In one area there were a bunch of people arm wrestling, this one muscular Australian-looking guy in an arm wrestling contest. In another there was this group of 4 people sitting at a table with 2 males bickering with each other and the 2 females chatting like nothing was wrong. Then there was an all-out fight between a guy who was on fire and a guy with a Mega Man-style cannon that resembled a shark who were fighting in a metal section of the bar. Then there were these other 3 people who were playing poker with a dealer dressed like a weird car dealer outfit. Then all scattered throughout the building were people who you couldn't mistake for others. Well, what do you think? Kuro asked Uraraka, who just looked at him wide-eyed as the door closed and locked itself with a metal bar and was metal on the inside rather than wood on the outside part of the door. Where are we? Uraraka asked, suddenly suspicious of what she had just gotten herself into. Well, Uraraka. Welcome to the villain pub. Uraraka was completely quiet. Here she was sitting at a table looking at a menu with her date right across from her. Why she was quiet, she was in a restaurant that housed villains. So have you decided what you want yet? Kuro asked Uraraka to put his menu down. No. But more importantly, why are we here? Uraraka said a bit loud but was not noticed over the surround sound of arguing and fights. What? They have good food here and for cheap prices. Kuro motioned for one of the servers to come to their table. But why is it full of villains? Uraraka demanded as the waiter arrived. The water itself looked like a stitched-together walking scarecrow. It was entirely made of knapsack and burlap cloth that looked to be barely holding together. One number 12 and one number 15 with 2 waters. Kuro said as the waiter shuffled off, not even acknowledging with a response. What was that? Uraraka asked, a little frightened seeing more of the things shuffling around the place, some carrying food and drinks and others cleaning stuff. Those are just Stitcher's dolls. Completely harmless unless you tick them or him off. Kuro said he wasn't even scared of them. Again, I ask why there are villains here and you can act like you aren't scared. Uraraka asked Kuro as he just sat there looking around. Knowing them personally helps a lot. Kuro said as he nodded his head to someone in the back of the bar who got up and started walking over. What did you just do? Uraraka demanded as a guy with a tombstone and shovel on his back with a pick in his hands wearing a green hooded cloak started walking over. Invited you to meet one of my friends. Kuro said as the friend mentioned pulled up a chair and sat down. Uraraka grave robber and vice versa. Kuro said as grave robber was looking at the girl from under his hood. Come on, I don't bite. Grave robber said to Uraraka, who was currently shaking with fear. After all, there was another villain just talking to her like he wasn't a wanted criminal. What's wrong with her? Grave robber asked as he saw she zoned out. First time actually talking to a villain aside from me. Kuro said as grave robber just gave the expression and nodded. Well, anyway, nice meeting you, Uraraka. Anyway, Atsu, I gotta scream to make a deadline in a few, so see you later. Grave robber said while getting up and exiting the building. After that the server comes back and puts the orders on the table and then shambles off again. The orders were 1 bowl of katsudan and 1 bowl of pork ramen. However, seeing as Uraraka was still shocked with both surprise and fear, he saw the opportunity to use Seiko's gift he gave him on the day he was grounded. Taking out a small vial filled with a black liquid and quickly spilling it in Kuraka's food and hiding the vial again, Kuro began to snap Uraraka out of her trance. So you gonna eat or let it get cold? Kuro asked while snapping the chopsticks apart, breaking Uraraka out of her daze. Who was that? Uraraka asked as she looked around confused like she forgot at the last minute. Friend of mine who hangs here often. Kuro said while slurping a bite of his food. So why did you invite him over? Uraraka said in a more harsher tone. At this, Kuro slightly choked on his katsudan but quickly swallowed it. How else are you going to get used to being around me and everyone else here? Kuro said nonchalantly as Uraraka wide-eyed him. What do you mean by that? You're lucky I haven't run out on you and got the heroes, Uraraka said as Kuro then himself went wide-eyed and quickly leaned over to cover her mouth with his hands. Hearing Uraraka, a few villains around the building looked at them and gave them the evil eyes as Kuro frantically motions for them to pay him and Uraraka no mind. After a few seconds everybody goes back to their own business as Kuro lets out a sigh of relief and sits back down. Why did you do that? Uraraka asked in a slightly frantic, curious, and demanding tone. Never mention the H word in that context here. Understand? Kuro said in a serious, strict tone. Why yay? Uraraka meekly said, nodding her head. Good. Kuro said, going back to eating. Uraraka just sat there for a moment to process everything that was happening. She was on a date with a villain who broke into her room to invite her on a date. Said date being to an unknown building which was literally crawling with villains, and mentioning heroes was considered taboo, and she didn't want to find out the punishment. So you gonna eat? Kuro asked while downing a swig of water. At this remark Uraraka looked at her food. It did look good, and this was a sort of treat for her, since she was used to budget-savvy meals. Reluctantly she began to slowly eat her bowl. To say it was tasty was an understatement. She made a mental note to ask Kuro if he knew the chef, so she could compliment them. As she was eating, Kuro let loose a small unnoticeable smirk deserving of Starscream status. So what do you think? Kuro asked in a more cheery tone. MPH, it's good. Uraraka said, swallowing a mouthful. Great. Now then, Dad said it would take about 30 minutes to work. So just make small talk. Kuro thought to himself as he watched Uraraka eat. Damn, why does she have to be cute when she eats? Kuro thought to himself as he watched Uraraka's cheeks puff when she ate, and the fact she was scarfing the food down, getting some around her mouth. So I take it, you don't normally eat like this? Kuro said, trying to make small talk. Uraraka just nodded, as she both didn't want to tell him about her life struggles, and she figured he knew since he had stalked her for 2 months. So I'm not really all that good at apologies, but I just wanted to say sorry for earlier and the last 2 months since I was watching you and you didn't know. Kuro said, bowing his head in an apologetic manner as Uraraka just blushed at this event and frantically told him it was okay and to not apologize. After that they both just ate without talking until Uraraka finished her bowl and stopped pushing it away. Enjoy the food? Kuro asked, noticing a black tinge in Uraraka's eyes, and smiled slightly. It was good. Thank you. Uraraka said while looking around. So apart from that guy you brought over before, do you know anyone else here personally? Uraraka asked. No, not really. Everybody knows Jester, though he's really just the resident info broker and black market guy, and Outback is one of the more infamous guys who come here, Kuro said as he leaned back in his chair looking at Uraraka. So what do people usually do around here besides eat? Uraraka asked, watching the two people in the metal part of the building continue their brawl. Pretty much all people do here is eat, get ripped off by Jester, try to beat Outback in an arm wrestle, or just converse and fight. Kuro said while motioning to the two mentioned individuals. So is Outback like the strongest guy here? Uraraka asked, looking back at the Australian individual who was sitting at a lone table chugging a bottle that read rattlesnake cobra venom on it. Not the strongest, but one of them. Kuro said, getting up. Where are you going? Uraraka asked as Kuro walked up to her. Just thought you might want to meet some of the big guys here. Kuro said, grabbing her hand and leading her over to Outback's table. Wait, are you sure we should disturb him? I mean, you said he was one of the strongest and that you didn't really know him. Uraraka said, nervous about approaching the man, literally chugging poison. I said I don't personally know him, but me and him are friendly. He's basically like the friend you know, but don't ask about. Kuro said as he approached Outback, who looked up at him. Outback's face was scarred with a cut going through one eye, making it completely white that looked like it had been made by a tooth. The vest he wore revealed his scarred chest that was riddled with bite marks and scars. Hey Outback, what's up? Kuro said, sitting down at Outback's table, who in turn glared at him, making Uraraka nervous. Boy, you got guts, kid. I'll give you that. Showing up after ditching us on poker night. Outback said, smiling as he sat up in his chair and set his drink down. So you're gonna introduce me to your date or you're gonna leave me in the dark? Outback said, looking at Uraraka, who was shaking nervously. You know you can sit right. Kuro said, motioning at the empty seat to Uraraka. Oh, alright. Uraraka said while nervously sitting down as she tried to not faint from panic. So Kuro, where you been last week, you bloody dingo? Me and the others have been missing ya. Outback said as took a swig from his cobra venom bottle. Got grounded for a week. Just got off. Sorry about poker night, but I'll be there next week. Kuro said while sneaking a look at Uraraka's face, seeing more of her eyes had a black tint and her face was slightly pale. Also Outback, this is my date. Kuro said nervously with a slight blush. Ha. Moving up, aren't ya, Wallaby? Outback said, laughing. So Outback was wondering if I could call in that favor you owe me from last game night I was at. Kuro said, smirking as the Outback jerked at this information. Well, what is it? Outback asked as Kuro got up and whispered something in his ear, to which Outback smiled at and got up. Sure thing, little buddy. After all, it doesn't sound too hard for the top of the good Australian food chain. Outback said, suddenly stabbing a machete into the table. Anyway, pleasure meeting you both, and I'll look into the thing for you, Kuro. Outback said, removing and sheathing the machete as he left the building as well. As Outback let the table soon break in half from the machete stab wound that was embedded in it. So what do you think of him? Kuro asked as they both got up from the remains of the table as more of the workers came to clean it up, not paying them any mind. He was unique. Uraraka said as she was just creeped out by the lifelessness of the workers of this place. Anyway, Kuro started while looking at Uraraka's face, which had become unnaturally pale and her eyes almost all black now as she was slightly off balance. Hey Kuro. Is it me or is the place spinning? Uraraka asked as she fell backwards, but Kuro caught her. It's nothing but a slight side effect. Give it a while. Kuro said as Uraraka started to fade out of consciousness. Side effects, Uraraka said as she tried to reach out to Kuro as she blacked out. The last thing she saw was Kuro's face smiling as she lost consciousness. Unknown location. Where am I? Uraraka asked no one as she woke up and saw she was in an unfamiliar area. Kuro, are you there? Uraraka asked as she took in her surroundings. As Uraraka looked around, she noticed she was on a bed. In the room she was in there was nothing that she could see since it was too dark. I guess I'll just, Uraraka started to say to herself, but stopped when she heard the sound of shuffling coming towards her. Who's there? Uraraka asked, inching away from the sound. However, she soon found herself against the wall of the room, unable to move out of shock and fear. As she closed her eyes and tried to brace herself for pain, she was surprised when it never came. Uraraka screamed, startled by one of the stitched-together workers who was now staring her in the face. That alone would have scared her, but the fact that roaches were going in and out of the mouth and eyes really didn't help her. Master summons me. Master summons you. The thing said in a garbled tone that sounded like a mix of choking and groaning. It was then the lights in the room came on and Uraraka saw where she was. It was a small room with just a bed and a door. However, the door was open and she saw through it. There were dozens more of the workers there that were either dragging things or carrying things all over the place. Come. Master demands it. The thing said as it waited for Uraraka to slowly start moving before it started its limping, shuffling, walk-breed mix out as well. When Uraraka exited the room, she saw that she was now in a large warehouse-sized area. However, she suppressed the urge to scream. It was when she stepped into the light that she noticed her hands and arms were an ungodly pale color, almost borderlining white. As she looked around, she saw various cells that housed weird amalgamations of various animals. It was at this point she started to walk up closer to the thing that was leading her. So, where are we going? Uraraka asked meekly, trying not to attract attention. The thing, however, did not give any indication that it hurt her and thus continued walking. After about 5 minutes of walking, they came to a stop at a large metal door. Strangely, when they got close, the door immediately opened without any sort of intervention from them. However, the same can be said for when they entered it, it immediately shut behind them. As Uraraka looked around, she saw she was back in the part of the building where she and Kuro were before she blacked out. However, she stopped herself from getting lost in thought as she followed the thing over to a table with 4 individuals playing a card game. She recognized one of them as Kuro, but with a different outfit, which made her wonder how long she had blacked out. The other 3 she did not know. One of them was male and wearing a lab coat but had metal gauntlets that covered his hands and a weird green face that seemed to be made of liquid. His eyes were also covered by these weird glasses. The one next to him was a female. Her face was half hidden by a weird visor headpiece that hid her eyes and upper head. And she was wearing a metal suit with various metal areas and various non-metal areas. The last one was also male, but had a piece of burlap covering the right side of his face, eye included, with a piece of burlap. He had this weird spindle on his right shoulder as well that was attached to a contraption on his arm that Uraraka didn't know what it did. As she walked up to the table, the thing spoke to the one with the burlap sewn on his head. Master. The girl is brought. It said as it stepped aside so the person could see her. At this, Uraraka was freaking out since she didn't know them and still had the images of what she saw in her mind. Thanks, Ragdoll. Dismissed. The person said as the ragdoll shuffled away back to where they came from. Take a seat, I promise we won't bite. The person said while looking at the cards in his hand. Is that alright? Uraraka said the only available seat was between the lab coat guy and the metal suit girl. It's fine, Uraraka. They know and actually would like to meet you. Kuro said, playing a card caused the metal girl to make a face of annoyance. Okay then. Uraraka said as she walked over and sat down. It was then she noticed her outfit had changed. Gone was her pink outfit and instead she saw she was wearing a black skirt and black and white hoodie. So Atsuhiro, would you like to introduce us to your partner? The guy in the lab coat said, setting his cards face down on the table looking next to him, causing Uraraka to freak out. Alright then. Uraraka is Blitzkrieg. Kuro said, motioning towards the woman in the suit. She did not give any vocal response, but nodded in Uraraka's direction. This is Meltdown. Kuro said, motioning to the person in the lab coat. It's a pleasure. It truly melts my heart. Along with many other things. Meltdown said, as his voice sounded like he was constantly gurgling water. And this is Stitcher. The owner, founder, and builder of this place. Kuro started, but was cut off by Stitcher. Oh yay. Kuro said nervously. Despite being a well-skilled fighter in his own right, he knew Stitcher was the last man anyone wanted to tick off. After all, the workers of the place are both dead and undead, proof of what Stitcher's quirk could do to someone he doesn't like. Nice to meet you all. Uraraka said nervously, as she tried to not make eye contact. Quite the catch, Kuro, I must say. Meltdown said, picking up his cards. True. It was nearly time for another female to join us here. Catherine, Cecilia, and I were beginning to grow tired of being the few who come. Blitzkrieg said, her voice was calm and authoritative. At that remark, Uraraka's blood went cold. What did she mean by joined us here, and why did she not like the sound of it? Silence. Both of you. I do believe it was your turn, Blitzkrieg. Stitcher said, as Blitzkrieg nodded and played a card. While that was happening, Uraraka was trying to think of a way to get herself out of here. While everyone here seemed nice, they were also villains. That was something she would have to keep in her mind if she wanted to ever get into UA. Then an idea popped into her head. Where's the bathroom? Uraraka asked, thinking that would be the best way to get herself alone so she could think. Blitzkrieg, you're the only girl here apart from her, so you show her. Stitcher said, as Blitzkrieg gave a small nod and got up, motioning for Uraraka to follow. They both walked in silence, occasionally passing a ragdoll or two, but no one else. Except when a guy was literally thrown in front of them, causing them to stop. Alright, that's it, you bloody bastard. The person said, as they lit on fire and charged at the person who threw them and tackled them down. Uraraka remembered them as the ones brawling in the metal area when she first walked in. However, her thoughts were cut short as both of them were suddenly being shocked with a few thousand volts each. How many times must I inform you? No fighting in the no fighting area. Blitzkrieg said, as two tentacle-like apparatuses were retracting back into the suit from the back. Apologies, Uraraka. They are most often always brawling like a cat and dog. Blitzkrieg said, looking over the twitching bodies of the two. As they continued on, they came to a stop at a door which opened and Blitzkrieg stepped aside. I trust you need not be monitored. Blitzkrieg said, as Uraraka nodded and walked inside as the door shut behind her. Uraraka went straight to the mirror and was surprised at what she saw. Her once peach-colored skin was now, as she discovered earlier, borderline white everywhere. Her once brown hair was now black. And her eyes, the two were brown, had gone completely black, like they were empty. This raised many questions, but the one she wanted answered the most was, what did they do to me? UA staff meeting room. So now that we're all here, Principal, may I ask what the purpose of this meeting is? Pro Hero Cementus asks the principal of UA Nezu, a dog bear mouse breed animal with a quirk. Yes, of course. Although I believe it would be better for Izawa to explain the details. Nezu states, motioning his muzzle toward a teacher wrapped in a yellow sleeping bag on the floor. As the teacher gets up from the sleeping bag, an aura of seriousness fills the room. Now then, I'm sure, as everyone knows, there has been an influx of villain escapes lately. The teacher Izawa states, as everyone in the room nods. Well, a recently captured villain that I apprehended let a valuable piece of information leak. Izawa continued until another person in the room stood up. This person resembled a skeleton with long blonde bangs going down the side of his face, reaching his waist. This was the number one hero, All Might's true form, Toshinori Yagi. Yes, All Might. Izawa said, looking at All Might. Well, I apologize for interrupting, Izawa, I believe I know where you are going with this. All Might said, as everyone looked at him. Well, don't keep the listeners waiting to get on with it. Pro Hero Present Mix says. Well, we know of villains setting up hiding places, they are more often than not found. Izawa says, but immediately continues. The villain I apprehended claimed he was heading to what is known on the circuit as the Villain Pub, a supposed meeting place and safe house for villains or the runner looking to lay low. Izawa concluded. At this news, everyone in the room fell silent. The thought of a massive hideout for villains right out in the open like this was mind-boggling. Breaking the silence, however, All Might spoke up. I too have heard of this Villain Pub from my friend in the police force. However, I do not know any details about it apart from its existence. I was hoping you could shed some light on that, Izawa. All Might said, sitting down. Yes. Well, the layout appears like a simple dining facility. The villain apparently said the place is run by someone called Stitcher. Izawa said, causing All Might to go bug-eyed. Are you certain they said Stitcher, Izawa? All Might asked in a worried tone as everyone turned to him. Do you know All Might? Aizawa asked like he already knew the answer. All Might neglected to say anything for a few moments, but then spoke up. Yes, I know him. However, it was before I became the number one. However, he was a vicious villain in his days around 20 years ago. All Might said, causing the room to explode into commotion. 20 years. Are you sure, All Might? Pro Hero Midnight asked, as the room calmed down, as they again looked at All Might. Yes. Well, I only encountered him once, he was still a terrifying man with a quirk that matched his personality. All Might said, as the room stayed silent, and he continued. His quirk was dubbed Skin Thread by the media, as it allowed Stitcher to use his skin as a thread that, if in case someone no longer living, could revitalize them into a mindless doll. All Might said, as gasps were heard around the room. A fate worse than death. Pro Hero 13 said, shocked. So you're saying we could potentially be charging into a Frankenstein wanted creator? Pro Hero Snipe said, as Nezu motioned for them to be quiet. Well, All Might, this Stitcher does sound like a tremendous foe that shouldn't be taken lightly. However, I doubt we know the entire story. Nezu said, as All Might nodded. Yes. Though he isn't a fighter, he will get his hands dirty. When he was defeated, it was Gran Torino who delivered the final blow on him. All Might said, as some of the pros in the room were taken aback at that statement. Though Gran Torino was retired, it was no secret that many of UA's older staff knew him, since he used to teach there. The fact the Stitcher could hold his own against him was a feat many villains couldn't say for themselves. So care to explain why he's been hiding for 20 years then, All Might? Eraserhead says, to which All Might explains. The last fight he had with Gran Torino before he retired, Gran Torino landed a massive kick to his face, completely destroying the right part of it. All Might said, shuddering, as the image of Stitcher's face after the attack appeared in his mind after years of forgetting it. My. It appears then that this could potentially be a problem in the future. Nezu said, rubbing his chin. I say we just bombard the place with artillery. Surely the military would lend their support. Pro Hero Vlad King said, as Eraserhead shook his head. Much as I hate the media, that would be a story they would eat up like vultures to roadkill. Eraserhead said, as nods and murmurs of agreements were heard. Well, considering that All Might seems to know more about this villain than any of us, I suggest that we let him come up with our plan. Nezu said, as everyone looked to All Might. After moments of quiet, All Might finally spoke. If we're going to fight and finally defeat Stitcher, we're going to need his help. All Might said, shudderingly, thinking about the future call he would be making. Flashback 20 years ago. Live up already, Stitcher. A man in a white hero suit with yellow boots, gloves and a cape said, panting. This was Gran Torino in his hero days before he shrunk and retired. Currently he was badly injured, as was his opponent. Surrender. Please tell Gran Torino how long we have been doing this. Stitcher said, smiling, as he readied his weapon for an attack. The weapon he created that was mounted on his right arm and connected at the shoulder and along the arm was called the seamstress. The seamstress was of simple design, literally just a modified spinning wheel on his shoulder that harvested skin from his back that was then moved along his arm until it reached the end, where it ended in the exo hand claws that he manipulated with his hand. AN. If anyone has seen Coraline, think of the other mother's spider hand for design. Stitcher. We both know how this will end. Gran Torino said while narrowing his eyes. True, we both know how this will end. Stitcher said, as the seamstress began spinning, harvesting his quickly regenerating skin. With you defeated. Both of them shouted, running towards each other, as Gran Torino zipped quickly around Stitcher faster than any normal person could see. However, Gran Torino knew Stitcher too well. As the seamstress harvested his skin, Stitcher created a web of it all around him that acted like one big net. If Gran Torino tripped one, it would cause all of them to constrict around him. At the same time, Stitcher's skin regenerating factor was currently overtaxed since both of them were badly beaten and battered. What's wrong with Torino? Afraid of the big bad spider? Stitcher said, smirking, as he saw the frustration on Gran Torino's face. As a hero, one must face their fears. Gran Torino said, as he charged up a massive burst of speed through his jet legs as he quickly zipped through all the skin threads towards Stitcher. Please, if you think it'll be that easy, then guess again. Stitcher said, as the seamstress harvested his skin at a faster rate, creating hundreds of more microscopic threads that Gran Torino quickly and effortlessly dodged them all. Panicking, Stitcher began overcharging the seamstress to work faster. However, as this happened, his skin regeneration factor cut out and the seamstress was tearing itself apart. Stitcher screamed in pain as the seamstress started to tear itself apart as his skin caused it to jam and Gran Torino zoomed closer. You're defeated. Gran Torino said, stopping midair before Stitcher as his eyes widened as Gran Torino let loose a large roundhouse kick to his face at a speed faster than sound, right as the seamstress exploded, creating a large blast and smokescreen. The blast temporarily disoriented Gran Torino. However, Stitcher left him one last thing before he disappeared. Mark my words, Gran Torino. Even if it takes me decades, I will kill you. Stitcher screamed as the smoke faded and he was nowhere in sight. Villain pub present time. That day was still in Stitcher's mind. Even now, as he was playing cards with his most trusted villains, that he knew he still remembered that promise he made. To kill Gran Torino. Though his face never healed, even though his healing factor recovered, it never repaired his face, forcing him to hide it behind his own skin thread. Ace of spades, beat that. Meltdown said, throwing his card down, as everyone at the table except for Stitcher let out an annoyed grunt. As everyone at the table who was playing slid the winnings to Meltdown, who grabbed them in his metal-clad hands. So who's dealing this round? Kuro asked, as everyone threw their cards to the center. I dealt with it last time. Meltdown said, as he leaned back in his chair. Neither of you will deal. Stitcher said, as both Meltdown and Kuro looked at him. What exactly do you mean, sir? Kuro said, as Stitcher stood up. You brought an outsider into the pub, Kuro. Stitcher said, as Kuro started fidgeting nervously. But sir, you gave me your consent to. Kuro said, as Stitcher eyed him, tearing into his soul. I did. And that is why she must prove herself. Stitcher said, walking over to Kuro. When your father asked me for my experimental vial, I gave it to him for 2 reasons. Stitcher told Kuro, who was trying not to show his fear and failing at it. The first reason is because I owed him a favor. Stitcher said, looking towards the side towards Blitzkrieg, who, even though was across from the building, saw him and gave a nod. But the second reason, Stitcher said, was that a loud screech was heard from inside the woman's bathroom as the entire building went quiet. Was to give it a beta test. Stitcher said, smiling, as the door burst open, as the people near backed away minus Blitzkrieg, who walked in front of the open door frame. As people stayed quiet waiting for whatever made the sound to walk out. As small footsteps were heard coming out of the bathroom, Uraraka stepped into the light. Many of the small-time villains backed even farther away, but the more dangerous and experienced ones walked forward. Uraraka's eyes were no longer pitch black and had changed back to normal eyes, but retaining blacker eyes. Her skin was still pale, but now more similarly matched Kuro's color of pale, but slightly paler, and her hair still remained black. However, the more prominent change was her attitude. Gone was her jittery and scared attitude she had when she first walked in, and in its place was a more confident and menacing aura. As Uraraka walked past Blitzkrieg, neither gave acknowledgement to the other, but both started walking back towards the table as the villains who were in the way backed off. A substance so strong that it can turn even the most kind and cheerful person. Stitcher started as Uraraka and Blitzkrieg sat down but switched seats, so Uraraka sat next to Kuro. Into a dark villain worthy of being in my ranks. Stitcher said as Kuro looked at Uraraka with wide eyes. As Stitcher finished, he sat back down and motioned for Blitzkrieg to shuffle and deal, to which she nodded. As Kuro still looked at Uraraka, he could feel the dark aura that surrounded her. And he loved it. True, he found her attractive before, but now he truly was drawn like a moth to a flame. She still had the face he originally adored, but now she closer matched his style in both look and color. So Uraraka wants to join in. Kuro said as Uraraka looked at him. At this, Uraraka looked towards Kuro as he saw her eyes and was still drawn to them. Only if you're planning to pay up after I win. Uraraka said confidently, replacing her stutter she had before, as Kuro smiled. I'm a man of my word. Kuro said as he did a mock bow while he was still sitting in the manner of a gentleman like he was taught from Seiko. As the both turned back to the table, Blitzkrieg dealt the cards to everyone including Uraraka, who despite the personality shift looked slightly confused. Leaning over to Kuro, she whispered a question to him. So what are we playing? Uraraka said as she gave off a nervous smile reminiscent of her old personality. Basically, play the highest card you have and hope you win. Kuro said bluntly, pulling out a small bunch of money and giving it to Uraraka. Unfortunately, we pay to play here. Kuro said as everyone around the table did the same thing, putting money in front of them. Okay, got it. Uraraka said as everyone was looking at what card to play. The game continued for a couple rounds until it was the last one. At this point, everyone knew a winner would be decided, as the highest card left would be the ace of spades. However, only one person was holding it. And she was excited. I win. Uraraka said cheerily as everyone played their lower ranked cards as she grabbed the winnings. As the cards were gathered in the center, Stitcher grabbed them and returned them to the box, causing everyone to look at him. It's closing time, my friends. Stitcher said as everyone else nodded. The table minus Sharknado and Pyrocide, the two who were constantly fighting, got up and left, leaving only them plus the ragdolls throughout the building. So what now? Uraraka asked, looking around as those around the table were getting up, and she did the same. Now we discuss with the other members of the circuit. Stitcher said, as the doors that led to the warehouse portion opened up and everyone present followed Stitcher through. However, Uraraka stayed close to Kuro, who was reaching into his coat and pulled out a mask and put it on. Uraraka just looked up at the mask with awe. She instantly knew who Kuro was. As everyone walked through the doors and walked towards the center of the warehouse, a larger table rose up from the concrete floor, along with more seats than people were present. As those present minus Uraraka knew where to sit, she just stood there awkwardly looking where to sit. "Just stand behind marble for now," Stitcher said, as a wall rose up around the table and several holographic projectors in the empty seats lit up. Images of other menacing villains were displayed sitting at the table in various positions. "I hereby call the weekly meeting of the villain circuit to order." A hologram surrounded by darkness and merely just displayed a black muscular silhouette, said in a menacing deep voice. As we all are well aware, hero activity has increased dramatically in the last few months to match the rise in villain activity. A hologram next to the silhouette once said. This hologram displayed a man with red sunglasses in a black leather jacket and black combat pants, with 2 guns on his waist, and black leather gloves, and black hair set, to which many around the room nodded. "In response to this, we have had to further decrease our operations than before," the same hologram said. At that remark, many around the room were both holographic and did not look frustrated. "Are you serious? Already we've basically gone down to doing nothing for a year just to keep us a secret, and now we're going further into hiding." Pyro sighed, a man that could be considered the villain endeavor yelled, causing Uraraka to flinch, but everyone else seemed to act like it was normal. "Well, your frustration is warranted," Pyro sighed. "We have special plans that you will find rather interesting," the hologram said in an attempt to calm the well-known raging flamethrower of the group. "Fine then. Just get on with it already, Dreadshot," Pyroside said, as he just leaned on his handboard. At this, the hologram Dreadshot continued. "As our many informants have gathered information over the last months, they have found out a great piece of information," Dreadshot said, waiting to continue as he noticed Uraraka and narrowed his eyes behind his deep red shades. "Who is she?" Dreadshot asks, as everyone minus Kuro looked towards Uraraka as she kept her confidence she had a while ago. "That, my dear fellow members, is my beta test of my latest project," Stitcher said as the attention shifted to him. "Explain yourself, Stitcher," the silhouette hologram said in an interesting tone. "This violates several regulations for security of the meeting, sir," Dreadshot said to the silhouette. "I am willing to overlook that depending on the results," they said as Stitcher nodded and began to speak. "While the full result is unknown, I can say that the result is what we had originally hoped to achieve," Stitcher said as many present looked at Uraraka. "However, I have only been able to observe the result for 3 hours and cannot make the most accurate conclusion without further observation," Stitcher said as the silhouette gave a nod and looked towards Uraraka. "So Black Marble, I take it you were the one who gave her the prototype," the silhouette said, which caused Kuro in his Black Marble persona nodded in acknowledgement. "Then I am personally assigning you to be her monitor aside from Stitcher," the hologram said, causing everyone to murmur with each other aside from Stitcher, Kuro, Uraraka and Dreadshot. "Silence," the person bellowed out, causing everyone to immediately shut up and listen. "The way I see it now, this meeting is adjourned. But before that," the person said, looking at Uraraka. "Since she is aware of us now, Stitcher, you are to properly induct her into the circuit and add a place for her at the table," they said, causing many to give glances towards the mentioned girl, who started shaking under all their gazes. "Understood, sir," Stitcher said as everyone looked at him. "Very good. Meeting will continue next week. As always, remain vigilant for our time to rise up," the person said. "Meeting adjourned," the person bellowed as all the holograms disappeared and the wall around the table fell and everyone got up. "So what just happened?" Uraraka asked as everyone minus Stitcher and Sharknado started welcoming her. "What just happened, Uraraka?" Kuro started but was interrupted by Stitcher walking over. "Is you're now a member of the villain circuit," Stitcher said as he snapped his fingers and a few ragdolls came over, with one holding a bottle delicately. "Let the ceremony of induction begin." "Initiation?" Uraraka asked as she eyed the bottle Stitcher was now holding. "Consider yourself lucky. Normally intruders or unwelcome guests are killed on the spot," Sharknado said bluntly as he fiddled with his arm cannon. At that, Uraraka gulped but let a sigh of relief escape her mouth. However, as she looked around, it seemed the villains that once intimidated her held no malcontents toward her. "Everybody in positions," Stitcher said as everyone stopped what they were doing and encircled Uraraka, causing her to look directly at Stitcher. "By accepting this drink, solemnly swear to shed the skin of the past and instead bear the skin of the future," Stitcher said as Uraraka hesitated but nodded confidently. "Then by all means drink," Stitcher said, tearing the cap of the bottle, smiling and handing it to Uraraka. Eyeing the bottle, Uraraka thought 1,000 things per second. Granted, the liquid Kuro put in her food altered literally everything about her. Ironically, as Kuro watched Uraraka in deep thought, it reminded him of when he was Izuku, debating whether or not to join Seiko, which eventually led him here to be one of the villain circuit's best thieves and infiltrators. Even still, he regrets leaving his mother behind, so he can understand the hesitation, but knows what the end result will be. As Uraraka continues to stare at the bottle, everyone around her starts whispering a verse she can't make out. Yet this simple act makes her raise the bottle to her lips and slowly down the entire thing, causing everyone to stop chanting and back up. Suddenly, as the last drop of liquid goes down Uraraka's throat, all her muscles tense up and freeze, causing her to drop the bottle, which shatters on the ground. Doubling over and clutching her stomach in pain, she lets out a scream of pure agony, as loud as possible. Looking down at the display, Stitcher couldn't help but smile a little. True, since he had gotten older he had lost his younger self sadistic side that enjoyed seeing others in pain. But this smile wasn't of sadism, but rather curiosity. He was curious to see how the vial Kuro had given Uraraka would react to the initiation liquid. The pain is only momentarily. Afterwards it will be much better, Stitcher said as Uraraka looked at him through her pained face. What Stitcher saw in her eyes was pure determination, as her eyes returned to the complete blackness before and she reverted to the borderline white pale she had hours before. However, what happened next surprised everyone present. Even though the pain was still going full force, Uraraka managed to pull herself off the floor and stand. After everyone recovered from the shock of this feat, they began slowly clapping. Clap clap. This continued for about 30 seconds as the pain died down and Uraraka could stand without shaking everyone around her and broke the circle. Congratulations, Stitcher says, walking forward and looking down at Uraraka. Due to their height difference, you pass. Uraraka stood dumbfounded at that statement until she felt a hand on her shoulder. Looking around, she saw it was Kuro, who had removed the mask and was smiling. Welcome to the gang, Kuro said as he started leading her back into the service area of the building with everyone else following. Let's party, Pyrocide says as his hands light on fire and are then subsequently put out by Sharknado, who just snickers behind his bandana. I'm sorry, did I get you wet? Sharknado bursts out in laughter as Pyrocide just growls in anger as he bursts in flames and charges tackle Sharknado into the metal area of the building and starts having brawl number 374. I'll break them apart, Blitzkrieg says, sighing as she walks over to the shouting duo of polar opposites. Does this happen often? Uraraka asks as she watches Blitzkrieg hold the two apart like children, trying to get them to stop. More than you can think, says, sitting down at the table they played cards earlier. They're just like children when you think about it, Meltdown says, leaning back in the chair he sat in earlier. Sadly, I must agree, Stitcher says, sitting in his chair snapping his fingers as ragdolls in the room start reacting like being given an unknown order. Let go, Blitz. If you don't unhand me, bitch, I will cremate you to an early grave. Both Pyrocide and Sharknado yell as Blitzkrieg just looks frustrated and blasts them across the building with her quirk Sonic Wave, successfully knocking them out. Should we check on them, or they're fine? Uraraka starts, but Kuro cuts her off, saying they've done worse to each other. After about a minute, everyone is calm and sitting at the table with two added chairs for Sharknado and Pyrocide. Now then, let's discuss how things work around here, Stitcher says as everyone nods, including Uraraka, but gets a feeling of uneasiness as Stitcher leaned closer to her on the table. Bue hi. There were not many things that could make the number one scared. However, what he was about to do was in the top 3 of the list. Sighing as he dialed the number to his old homeroom teacher from his UA days, he tried hard not to sweat. After ringing a few times, someone picked up on the other line. Tashinori, to what I owe the pleasure of this call, Gran Torino said in his old folk persona and not his hero one that had All Might on edge. I'm sorry, Gran Torino, but this isn't a social call, All Might says, bracing for what he knew was about to happen. So you go off to get that teaching job at UA, already making it to where you can't call, and on top of that you hardly call to begin with, Gran Torino said loudly over the phone, causing All Might to flinch. It's about Stitcher, sir, All Might said, causing Gran Torino to go completely silent. What about him? Gran Torino asks in a demanding tone. We don't know much, but Eraserhead believes he has a lead that could lead us to him or a massive gathering place of villains, All Might says. I'm going there by myself and Tashinori. I swore to bring him in, and by God I will do it, Gran Torino says bluntly, hanging up the call. That could have gone better, All Might says, sighing and pocketing his phone. Deciding what he should do now, All Might decides to check on Izawa to see if he can personally see this person he captured and interrogate them. Walking down to class 1 where he finds Izawa in his sleeping bag, All Might decides to wake him up. Yes, All Might? Izawa asks before All Might even gets close to him, revealing himself to be awake. All Might, taken slightly aback by this, quickly regains composure and asks Aizawa if he can interview the villain he caught that informed him about Stitcher. Currently Nezu is interviewing him in his office. Aizawa says shooting All Might off and falling back asleep. All Might then bows an apology and then heads up to Nexus' office. Entering his buff form, All Might knocking on Nexus' office door, earning him a come and please from the principal. All Might, I take it you came to see him. Nezu says, motioning to the person sitting in front of his desk bound in handcuffs and quirk restraints. Yes, I have. Now then, villain, I strongly suggest you to comply and make this easy for all of us. All Might says to Nezu and then turns to the villain, who displays no reaction to the number one hero addressing him. I'm afraid, All Might, this villain is one tough shell to crack. Nezu says as the villain remains emotionless. Well then, perhaps when Gran Torino arrives he can gather some information. All Might tells Nezu, as at the mention of Gran Torino's name the villain begins panicking and freaking out but not speaking. My, that seems to have provoked a response. Nezu says, rubbing his chin. Will you cooperate now or wait till he gets here and let him do it? All Might asks the villain, who despite panicking, refuses to let up information. However, unknown to both All Might and Nezu, the villain was currently putting up an act to slowly pick the locks on his restraints. You continue to worsen things, my good fellow. For your sake, please cooperate and we can work out a deal. All Might says, pulling up a chair and sitting down in front of the still panicking villain. At that remark the villain starts snickering. Please make you think that I would fear heroes such as yourself. The villain says as the cuffs and quirk restraints snap off, catching All Might off guard. Bye fools. The villain says, spitting something out of his mouth on All Might and then biting the stream as it's still airborne, causing a small enough explosion to just create a smokescreen that blinds both people present. When they both regain sight the villain is gone without a trace. No open window, no open door, and no signs of breaking anything to cause an escape. Oh dear. Nezu says, sighing and rubbing his head, not worried the villain escaped. However, All Might just stares blankly at where the villain was and starts sweating profoundly. This is bad. All Might mutters under his breath, praying that he can find the villain before Gran Torino gets there. Villain pub 2 hours later. Things seemed to pick up after Stitcher explained how things worked around the pub and what was going to happen here. Since she couldn't go back home due to the fact her appearance and personality were altered drastically and they couldn't risk information falling into the hero's hands, she had a choice. She can choose to stay at the pub in the lounge area used for non-important private meetings. Or she could stay at Kuro's with him and Seiko until other arrangements could be worked out. Since they were given orders it had to be Stitcher or Kuro. Uraraka had yet to decide and was instead thinking about it while chatting with those present and even playing a few board games with them to pass the time. However, suddenly there was a series of frantic knocks at the door that repeated in a code. Open it. Stitcher orders the ragdolls as he takes a fighting stance, as does Pyroside and Sharknado. As the ragdolls open the door a person stumbles in a few steps before passing out on the floor. It's Claymore. Meltdown says as Stitcher and Blitzkrieg walk over to the passed out villain who was cut, bruised and bleeding. Who's that? Uraraka asks, confused about who just stumbled in. Claymore. Our explosive and demolition man. Sharknado says, walking up to Kuro and Uraraka. As Uraraka looked at the scene before her, seeing Stitcher using the seamstress to close up the open wounds on Claymore and Blitzkrieg having a heart rate scan appear on the visor over her eyes as she checks his vitals. Well, whoever did this to him has got skill. Pyroside says, walking up. He can last in a fight against me for 4 minutes and come out with a few second-degree burns. That's not really helping the situation, Pyro. Sharknado says, sideways looking at him, earning a glare in return. Hey. No fighting, you two, not now. Kuro says in a raised voice in an attempt to prevent another brawl from happening at the moment. Fine. Both individuals say, looking away from each other and walking away. So what's going to happen? Uraraka asks Claymore to start twitching his hands. We wait till he wakes up and then find out what happened. Kuro says angrily, since he knew Claymore like he knew Grave Robber. Despite his history with explosion-related quirks like Bakugo's, he had rather grown a friendship with Claymore. Just thinking about who did this made Kuro angry. Not only was Claymore a close friend, but also the one who vouched for him to have a seat at the elite inner circle. Kuro's hand balled into a fist as his face contorted with rage, catching Uraraka by surprise, since she had never seen Kuro like this. Are you okay, Kuro? Uraraka asked, trying to calm Kuro down, seeing his eyes fill with anger. When I find who did this to him they will wish it was Pyroside they were facing. Kuro said, turning to look at Uraraka, who had begun sharing his anger. Then how about you and I do it together? Uraraka says, smiling sadistically, wrapping Kuro in a hug, snapping him out of his anger. Why not make it a date then? Kuro says, tightening the hug, as those who weren't attending to Claymore or a ragdoll just looked away. Kids. They all sigh, remembering their youth. Back with Blitzkrieg and Stitcher, Claymore was beginning to stabilize and regain consciousness. My aching head. Claymore says, rubbing his head and standing up. What happened? Stitcher demands, as he deactivates the seamstress. Hero got me from behind with a cheap shot. Couldn't use my quirk and got knocked out. Claymore says, cracking his neck. I advise against strenuous activity for now until your body properly heals. Blitzkrieg says, as she walks away. What happened after you were knocked out and regained consciousness? Stitcher asks, as Claymore sighs. They used a truth-telling quirk on me. They got out that this place exists and that you run it. That's all. Claymore says, to which Stitcher looks angry. Damn. Won't take long for word to reach him then. By that time they'll have this place's location pinned down. Stitcher says, slamming his fists on a table, breaking it in two. Everyone watched this scene with interest. It had been 15 years since the pub was founded and had always remained a secret to those who weren't in the circuit or affiliated in some way. Now that they were found out, they would have to inform the leader of the circuit, who was not one to like bad news. So what happens now? Uraraka asks, as she watches those present, including the ragdolls, go off somewhere or work on their weapons on themselves. Now we pray the boss doesn't kill us all. Meltdown said, adjusting his metal gauntlets that were attached to his suit. That doesn't sound good. Uraraka says, looking over at Kuro, who was checking his hidden coat pockets and belt compartments. No, it's not. Kuro said. But it'll be worse if we don't tell him. Then what do we do? Uraraka asks, as Kuro puts on his mask, assuming his black marble persona. We fight. Pyroside says, his body is lighting on fire, but somehow not burning his clothes. No. Stitcher rasps out, causing everyone to look at him as he looms over the wreckage of the table he smashed. As far as we know, they don't know exactly where we are. Stitcher says, meekly, earning a nod from Sharknado and Blitzkrieg. Unless. Stitcher says suddenly, as the seamstress shot out strands of his skin thread around Claymore's body, who stood there in shock. However, as if searching for something, the strands all latch on to something and retract into Stitcher's hand. Damn it. Stitcher screams, crushing the thing in his hand and dropping its remains on the floor, proceeding to stomp it repeatedly. Burn its remains. Stitcher demands from Pyroside, who shoots out a stream of fire at the thing as everyone steps out of the way, as once the fire is finished, Sharknado uses his cannon to douse the flame. They put a tracker on you, idiot. Stitcher screamed, grabbing Claymore by the throat and raising him in the air. How did I know? Claymore wheezes in between breath, struggling to breath under Stitcher vice-like grip. Maybe by following protocol. Stitcher screams as Blitzkrieg puts her hand on his shoulder to calm him down. Fine. Stitcher says, as if an unspoken conversation just happened between them, releasing Claymore. Blitzkrieg calls the others of my inner circle. Tell them Operation Blackout is beginning. Stitcher says, walking past everyone towards the back rooms of the building where his experiments are kept. What's Operation Blackout? Uraraka asks in confusion, sensing the change in atmosphere around the room. As everyone looks at each other before they say anything, Blitzkrieg speaks. Operation Blackout initiates when the location of Villain Pub is compromised. It includes gathering Stitcher's inner circle and beginning an assault to draw attention away from here. Blitzkrieg says, pressing a series of buttons on her forearm computer. And where are we attacking? Uraraka asks, smiling sadistically again. UA high. Idiot. That fucking idiot. Stitcher screamed in his head in his private lab in the back of the warehouse area. Despite how close he was to his ultimate goal, Claymore got himself captured and tracked. Stitcher should just go ahead and feed him to the dolls. Damn. By now Torino is aware. Stitcher grumbled to himself, staring down at his discarded face mask that now rested still in front of a mirror. Even now the scars of our conflict remain. Stitcher said, touching the reflection of his face. Or rather, where the right side of his face would be. All that remained of it. In its place was a mound of raw flesh akin to that of a deformed, mutated individual. His eye was hardly even visible and barely functioned without the eyepiece in his mask. 20 years, and yet my healing factor merely sealed the wound in place. Stitcher said, lamenting his defeat. As much as he hated to admit it to himself, Stitcher could not deny he lost that fight. What's more, he wouldn't even be here if it weren't for the circuit. Without them he would most likely be rotting in Tartarus with all the other villains. But Stitcher refused to be a mere pawn in the endgame. No, Stitcher was biding his time while he amassed his own inner circle of elite who would be both loyal to him and the circuit. But now Claymore ruined it. It took him years to establish the pub and his main base, and even more to amass his inner circle of pawns. However, they could not be disposed of easily. If they wanted, they could kill him easily if they all wanted. No, what kept them from that was Blitzkrieg. She was the one of few who he couldn't lose. She was a jewel in the rough that he found. A bright mind and no family on the streets. He took her in and raised her. She was loyal to him to the point of being his second in command. I know you're coming to Torino. But that's why this time I'm striking first. Stitcher said, donning his face mask, which was followed closely behind by his battle gear. Along with the seamstress he wore combat boots, grey patched pants, and metal shoulder guards. Due to his quirk his skin had a durability that could match low-grade metals. With Operation Blackout initiated now all I require is time. Stitcher said, checking the seamstress. Walking out of his private lab, Stitcher walked all through the warehouse complex of the pub. He passed by all of his so-called abominations that were his science projects. Most of them seemed like amalgamations of various animals with mismatched heads and limbs with stitched patterns and marks everywhere. Honestly, people these days were so blind to quirks that they forgot the original building blocks of science. No, Stitcher was not blinded like most were. He loved genetics, and chemical science was his love. It took him years to truly use his quirk and more to master it like he had. But his crowning achievement in his field of research was what was now inside the girl Atsuhiro brought in. Ochaco came to him and asked him for it to give to his son. Stitcher saw the opportunity. The corrupt one, pure of heart with an ounce of liquid. Stitcher said, passing the cages that held the other failed attempts that were now mindless rampaging beasts. Stitcher found himself chuckling softly, something he didn't do often. He barely even saw the girl before the drug took effect and spoke with her even less. But he had eyes and ears on her since she walked in. And once again he hit the scientific jackpot. Where the others failed and became mindless beasts of destruction, she became the ideal teenage villain. More cruel, more sadistic, and more confident, all traits Stitcher needed in her. While not perfect, she was an acceptable result, especially since she was Kuro's girlfriend and still a teenager. The time is nigh, my creations. Soon the world will be shown just how blind they truly are. Stitcher monologues to himself as he walks past the ragdolls doing various things. The ragdoll creation process took years to perfect. And a long time to get used to feeling your skin move around and encase something before breaking off. Still, they made good workers and cannon fodder. However, Stitcher had to stop, thinking to himself as he was approaching the door to the main area of the pub and once more made sure everything was in check. Opening the door, he wasn't at all surprised by the scene before him. Blitzkrieg was trying to keep Sharknado and Pyrocide from leveling the place. Kuro, Uraraka, and Grave Robber were talking with each other. Outback was sitting at his usual spot chugging boomslang venom. And Jester was attempting to swindle Meltdown into buying a new type of metal quirk-based alloy and was about to, if not for Stitcher's arrival. And then there was Claymore, who was bound by skin thread to a chair and was unconscious. However, at Stitcher's arrival everyone stopped and looked at him. They all remained quiet in order to let him say something, which he did. It's been 10 years since I made this group. Stitcher began speaking calmly. And now, after years of keeping this place a secret and years of planning to overthrow the Circuit High Council, it's all crumbling down due to Claymore's incompetence. Oh, think escaping without them tracking you isn't a possibility. Stitcher yelled as Claymore, who had regained consciousness, started sweating. And so now I'm left with the choice. Stitcher said, regaining a calm composure and slowly walking towards Claymore. Do I use you as a lab experiment or do I use you as bait? At this, Claymore started sweating profusely as he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head, followed by unconsciousness as Grave Robber knocked him out with a shovel. All in favor of being a lab rat? Stitcher asked the others as Meltdown and Sharknado raised their hands. And all in favor of being bait for the heroes? Stitcher said as then everyone raised their hand. Prepare the welcome mat for our guests. Stitcher said as the ragdolls that were in the room started moving around and disappearing one by one into different areas. The other members of his group proceeded to then do their own things to get ready. Don't worry, Torino. I know you'll be coming, but this time I will be the only one to worry about. Stitcher thought to himself. Blitzkrieg. Stitcher said as Blitzkrieg walked in front of him. Stitcher motioned for her to come closer, which she did. Then Stitcher whispered something in her ear, to which afterwards she nodded in confirmation and began typing on her ARM computer. This time not even the circuit will know what hit them. In a hidden bar. Inside a hotel complex in a hidden bar area, 3 people sat there staring at a computer screen. One a man made out of black mist wearing a bartender suit with a metal collar. Another was a bluish-haired man in a black t-shirt with a hand on his face covering it. The final was a man smoking wearing a purple blazer. These men are Kurajiri Shigaraki Tamura and Jiren respectively. The first 2 members of the League of Villains, the final a black market broker that associates with them. However, who was behind the monitor that read voice only, was the true leader of the league known as All for One. So you're saying the heroes have a lead on the circuit? Sounds pretty big to me. Jiren said, letting out a puff of smoke from his cigarette and went back to smoking it. Yes, Jiren, the heroes have indeed found a lead on one of the circuit's branches of operation. All for one said calmly behind the monitor. But why does this concern you, sensei? That just means less competition for us. Shigaraki said in a curious tone. I also wish to know. Kurogiri said while polishing the shot glasses behind the bar counter. Your curiosity is not unwarranted. While we remain enemies of the circuit, the group we are talking about is a splinter group led by the villain Stitcher. All for one said. Ah, I see. Kurogiri said. Stitcher was quite the formidable villain before he got injured. If he was so formidable, how did he get injured? Shigaraki said, looking at the screen. He ended up having to fight Gran Torino. All for one said in his usual calm tone. Doing that and only getting an injury and not getting captured is a strong enough feat in itself. So what does this splinter group have to do with us? Shigaraki asked, curious as to why they were concerning themselves with their enemies. The little friend of mine in the circuit has revealed that the leader knows of this group and has arranged for them to be taken out by the heroes. All for one said. So they plan to have the heroes do their own dirty work. Kurogiri said, not surprised that the leader of the circuit would do that. Yes. But we will make sure they won't succeed. All for one said. But master, why are we going to assist them? Shigaraki asked. Simple. Since they are an unknown splinter group, they would most likely take any action they can against the circuit after they are attacked. All for one said. But Kurogiri will make sure they aren't captured. Yes, sir. Kurogiri said, knowing better than to distrust All for one's judgment. By saving them they will be indebted to us. While some may prove less cooperative, the others will be glad that they won't be sent to prison. All for one told the others. But that raises another problem. All for one said. What problem? Shigaraki asked, confused. He was seeing this as a chance to gain valuable pieces on the chessboard, but didn't see a problem. If they made a splinter group in the circuit, what's to stop them from making a splinter group in our league? Bury around Villain Pub. Are you certain the citizens are safe in Toshinori? Gran Torino asked, as he and a few other high-level pro heroes were hiding around the area the tracker was last placed. Positive. Toshinori said in his All Might form. Then we move into attack. Gran Torino said before giving a signal for the heroes to advance. Remember, if you see anything that acts, walks, or looks like a living scarecrow, don't hesitate to attack. Gran Torino warned the others about the ragdolls. All Might, you are clear for attack. Pro Hero Erasure Head said from the rooftops as All Might gave the thumbs up and then proceeded to burst down the door. Minutes earlier inside the Villain Pub. How long does it take to string a guy up for bait? Stitcher asked, getting frustrated that it was taking them this long to prepare the trap. Well, sorry, but in case you didn't notice, I'm trying to not burn us all. Pyroside said angrily that Stitcher was nagging him. Just hurry up, if I'm right the heroes will be here in a few minutes. Stitcher said, making sure everything else was in place. Everything's in position, sir. Kuro said, as he was currently coming up from the underneath section of the pub that housed a series of escape tunnels. Everything important in my lab removed? Stitcher asked, making sure everything was going to plan. Apart from the beast set for the heroes. Kuro answered as he twirled with a few marbles in his hand. All of which were black in color. Good. Pyro, are you done yet? Stitcher said, looking to see that indeed Pyroside was done. What does it look like? Pyroside said, pointing to his work. But now everyone Detroit smash. Stitcher began but was cut off as All Might burst through the front door of the pub, sending everyone backwards who couldn't grab onto something or braced for the blast. Damn, he's here already. Pyroside said as flames licked up his body in rage. Now villains, make things easy on yourselves and surrender. All Might said as a few pros appeared behind him. He's here. Kuro thought excitedly. Now All Might, I will show you what it's like. Now we all know that he isn't one to surrender. Gran Torino appeared beside All Might as he and Stitcher bored each other's eyes. Ah, Gran Torino. It should come as no surprise that you would come. Stitcher said, growling. Come to your funeral. As a few heroes ready to charge, All Might held them back. Hold it, comrades. All Might said as the heroes stopped. This is a crafty villain. One cannot simply charge into his lair. But you kind of just did. Grave Robber pointed out at the fact he smashed down the wall. On Grave, I'd be more surprised if All Might didn't break down the wall. Kuro said while in his black marble outfit. Ah, so you're the newest villain known as the Black Marble. All Might said, recognizing the outfit. I find no coincidence that you would ally yourselves with the circuit. How perceptive, All Might. Kuro said, unable to hide his chuckling. What's so funny? Erasure Head said, appearing in the front of the group. It's just that for all your planning you really thought we would go down without a fight. Kuro said, throwing the marbles he had in his hand towards the heroes who stepped back, but All Might just stood there as they clattered to the ground. A rather interesting move. All Might said. but it appears it failed to achieve damage. Who said they were meant to cause damage? Kuro glanced to both sides as the others began picking themselves up. It was merely a distraction. All Might, seeing the other villains getting up, charged forward for an attack but found his fist caught by another one. "Boy. You want to fight, take me to your wallaby," Outback said, throwing All Might back. "Very well, villain," All Might said, charging for another attack, but it instead merely pushed Outback back a little as he returned with his own flurry of punches. Impressive strength. All Might thought I saw the other heroes moving forward to engage, but went wide-eyed seeing the floor and other things around the room break to reveal a small army of ragdolls. "Attack!" Pyrocide screamed as he sent a volley of fire towards the heroes, who broke apart to attack the ragdolls. "Yeah." Pro hero Present Mick sent out a scream using his quirk towards Blitzkrieg, taking out a few ragdolls along the way. However, as she raised her palms, she sent out her own wave of sound blasts, repelling his quirk. "DCH, looks like we got a fellow show host," Present Mick said as he used his quirk again, and the two were locked in a standstill. All around the pub there were explosions, fire, ice, water, wind, rubble, and other attacks happening from both sides. As pro hero Ectoplasm used his quirk to make clones of himself to fight the ragdolls, he was surprised to see they were on equal level with him. So instead he created a few clones to take out this shark-themed villain with a cannon in place of his right hand. "Target practice," Sharknado said as he unleashed a large volley of water shots from his blaster that took out every clone. It was dissolving them back into ectoplasm. As Ectoplasm continued to create clones, he realized that this villain was specifically targeting the cones and not him. The smart one, Ectoplasm thought. The other low-level pro heroes that were brought had to admit they were having trouble with the ragdolls. True to the briefing, they would not stay down till they were ripped apart. It also didn't help that when they were ripped apart, cockroaches poured out from them. This caused a few heroes to lose their lunch but continue to fight. "It's over, Stitcher," Gran Torino said after dodging another of Stitcher's attacks. "Why do heroes always say that when they're losing?" Stitcher said as he sent another attack. "Because we heroes are persistent," Erasure Head said, delivering a kick to Stitcher's back and recoiling away from him. But much to Erasure Head's surprise, the kick simply mildly irritated Stitcher, who growled in annoyance. "Jester!" Stitcher yelled as from across the room Jester heard this and drew the 8 of spades card and with precise accuracy threw it, and Stitcher caught it. Immediately the card dissolved into thin air and reappeared in Jester's deck, but with a darker hue to it as it recharged. As Stitcher absorbed its energy and his muscles slightly grew and the heroes backed up. "Die!" Stitcher yelled as he let loose a spinning attack that both Gran Torino and Erasure Head dodged. As Endeavor spouted his usual insults to villains and that the ragdolls were weak, he was suddenly blasted by a steady stream of fire. Turning to look, he saw what could be considered a smaller version of himself as a villain engulfed in fire with bloodshot eyes stood there as he continued to let loose his stream. Grunting, Endeavor began to use his own stream of fire from his Hellflame quirk and pushed Pyrocide's back. However, Pyrocide was only using one hand and then used both as his stream began pushing back. All Might, however, had to admit this Australian he was fighting was a challenge. Not only were his smashes having minimal effect, but this guy could pack a punch. However, All Might did not give up as he continued punching and eventually with a well-placed Detroit smash sent the villain flying into a wall, breaking a hole in it as he lay there. "Now villain, do you surrender?" All Might said. His smile was not faltering. But much to his surprise, the villain pulled himself up unfazed. "You know, very few things have driven me to quirk use." Outback began. A 9-headed fire-breathing crocodile, a metal shark with motor-like speed, and a bull with a growth quirk. Outback said as he threw off his hat and vest and closed his eyes. But when they reopened, they resembled the eyes of a reptilian, an alligator to be precise. "But it's fitting, isn't it?" Outback said as his skin began to turn green as scales formed over them and his teeth appeared more sharp. "That the number 1 hero fights the top of the Australian food chain." Outback finished as his fully quirked form was revealed to be a giant hulking alligator-like body. He was covered in scales and his teeth and nails grew to be razor sharp. Not to mention his eyes were tracking every slight movement All Might made. "A very interesting quirk," All Might said, charging with immense speed towards him, "but as a hero I will bring you in." However, to All Might's surprise, his attack had hit the wall, creating a much larger hole where the villain would be. As All Might looked around, he soon found nails being dug into his torso. Looking, he saw that the villain was behind him with his hands dug into his torso. Grunting, All Might was able to grab the villain and sling him away. Hissing, Outback got up and with speed was able to land a hit on All Might, who was anticipating it and blocked it. Sharknado and Ectoplasm were however having a more throw body and shoot the situation fight. As Ectoplasm continued to make clones, they were destroyed just as fast. But much to Sharknado's irritation, he was running out of water. Since he needed water from an outside source, he was running low on ammo. But he saw the pro hero manual across the battlefield and decided to break for him since his quirk produced water. Guro, however, was dispatching every hero that came close to him. They were the casual breed that always preached that good always prevailed and believed they would win. And that's why they all ended up bloodied and beaten. All Kuro really had to do was dodge an attack and then hit their vital points. Or he would throw one of his marbles that had been repurposed for combat. Explosions, smoke, poison, etc. Brave Robber was having a less successful time with battle though. Being that he was mainly proficient in everything not combat related, he was having to dodge and hit with his shovel. But he was saving his ace, which was on his back. Jester, however, kept up his usual business black market dealer persona, even offering a few things he had on him to the pros who scoffed at that. And they in turn were met with a cluster of Jester's diamond suit cards being shot at them and cutting them. Iroh's side was at a standstill with Endeavor, and both of them were boiling with rage. Suddenly at the same time they stopped using their quirk and rushed toward each other and exchanged fists. And Pyro's side was easily outmatched in raw strength. He could swear he felt his arm break as it went limp and hurt like hell. "Damn you bastard," Pyro's side yelled as he used his unbroken hand to send a stream of fire separating him and Endeavor. Eraserhead and Gran Torino were having a less successful time with taking down Stitcher as he just blocked every attack thrown at him. Not even Eraserhead's capture tape had no effect as it was easily thrown off or used to throw him. Plus his quirk was useless in this situation since it didn't affect mutant-type quirks. "What's wrong? Can't fight when you're not alone," Stitcher taunted Gran Torino as he was able to grab him in midair and throw him. "I was going to ask the same thing," Gran Torino retorted as he took out a ragdoll that came near him and used that as a ribbon to attack Stitcher. At this time most of the ragdoll herd had thinned and those remaining were being easily dispatched by the many well-known heroes. Present Mick, however, was having a less eventful duel. It appeared they both were on equal footing. However, his throat was getting sore and this girl showed no sign of pain. Grunting, Present Mick deactivated his quirk and was blasted into a crowd of the cockroaches and instantly screamed as loud as he thought, possibly sending the remaining ragdolls back. It appeared the heroes were winning as the villains, minus Stitcher, were all retreating to regroup and were all injured in some way. Outback had arguably some of the worst as he looked like his quirk had half activated as All Might's punches and blown off the scales. Pretty soon the spade effect on Stitcher wore off and he was also sent back. Grunting, all the villains crowded together as the heroes approached. "Give up, villains. You are defeated," All Might be said as the heroes grouped up around him. But much to everyone but the villains shocked, Stitcher started laughing. "What are you planning, Stitcher?" Gran Torino said as he readied himself. "It's just funny," Stitcher said as he snapped his fingers as the ground and back wall began to shake and crumble. "That you thought the ragdolls were my only creation." As the wall opened, it revealed dozens of stitched together amalgamations of animals with mismatched species and limbs. "I believe you know what to do," Stitcher said, looking at Blitzkrieg, who nodded. As the heroes all tackled the beasts, they found them much harder than the ragdolls to fight. It even took All Might a few punches to subdue them. But, as the heroes were preoccupied, the villains Stitcher fled into the escape tunnels. As per protocol, the tunnels collapsed behind them. "It appears this would be where I would die," Stitcher said as he saw his beasts being defeated. But Stitcher raised his other hand to snap his fingers. And when he did, the beasts heard the command and activated a self-destruct technique. This resulted in many hero deaths of the smaller, lesser-known ones. But the more experienced ones survived but were injured and a few dropped unconscious. But among those who were still standing was All Might and Gran Torino. "Give it up, Stitcher. Your forces have fled and you're out of tricks," Gran Torino said as Stitcher merely smiled. "You know, it's been 20 years and you haven't changed a bit," Stitcher said. "Nor have you," Gran Torino replied. But before the two could do anything, Endeavor let loose a massive burst of flames on Stitcher, who just stood there. All those conscious stared in shock as Stitcher remained unfazed, but his mask was burned off, revealing his face. A mound of flesh pulsating on its own that was scarred and sewn together. As to be expected of the number 2 hero, Stitcher said, not even fazed by his mask being burned. Endeavor merely growled in response as he prepared to charge but was held back by All Might. "What do you want?" Endeavor growled as All Might looked at him. "Do not stoop to his level, friend." All Might said, "This man will pay for his atrocities." "You're right about that," Endeavor said, shaking off All Might's hand. "A little infighting, Stitcher said, chuckling. "I'm afraid that it won't matter." At that declaration, Gran Torino tensed as he saw Stitcher reach behind him and pull out a slim object. But, as Gran Torino saw it, he immediately shouted to All Might. "Tashinori, get everyone out of here." Gran Torino said, as All Might 2 noticed the object and using the full speed of his quirk had gotten all of the heroes out along with Gran Torino. However, going back to look for his mentor, All Might noticed he was gone. To be expected for Gran Torino. Stitcher said, as now it was only him and Gran Torino left. You destroy my pub, ruin my projects, and worst of all think that you will win. Stitcher said, as he slowly tied skin thread down on the button of the detonator. The death trigger. Gran Torino said, as Stitcher smiled. Yes. You see, if I go unconscious then my quirk deactivates, causing the button to release and blow the rest of this place sky high. Stitcher said, throwing the detonator into a pile of rubble. Or I can forcefully deactivate it if you or another hero tries anything funny. Stitcher continued smiling. So then either I let you kill me or I kill us both. Gran Torino said, realizing where this was going. Yes, Stitcher said, as the seamstress charged up. Let this be our last dance. Both of them screamed, charging at each other. The end. Thanks for watching my video and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description. See you next time, till then sayonara.